You probably know someone who has the same personality type as you, but in some ways is quite different. Perhaps you are an ENFP with an ENFP buddy who is much more systematic than you. Or maybe you're an INTP and you fit all the INTP descriptions, except you're much more outwardly enthusiastic and expressive than what seems typical. After all, while there may be 16 personalities, we all know that there are more than just 16 types of people out there. Figuring out a way to explain these variations within a type is something typology nerds love to obsess over, and your boy is no different. It turns out the official Myers-Briggs type indicator has come up with an answer, an expansion to the original MBTI called Myers-Briggs Step II. Step II. The MBTI Step II explains these personality differences by splitting each of the 4 letter dichotomies into 5 facets called subtraits. Of course, by letter dichotomies, we mean I or E, N or S, F or T, J or P. Each subtrait has a theme and 2 opposite poles. You can think of them as like 5 mini dichotomies within the 4 main ones. This is really abstract. It sounds more complicated than it is, but let's look at some subtraits and you'll see what I mean. Let's start off with the first letter dichotomy, E versus I. So as we go through each of these subtraits, you'll see that each pole lines up with one side of the dichotomy. So right now, the subtraits on this side of the screen will typically correspond with the E types, the extroverts, while the subtraits on the other side will typically correspond with the I types, the introverts. The first subtrait we'll look at is initiating versus receiving, which describes the ways in which we interact with others. Initiating lines up with extroversion and receiving lines up with introversion. So an initiating person is someone who is comfortable starting or initiating a conversation or introducing themselves to others, while a receiving person is reserved and is either less comfortable starting conversations or is just not interested. Then we have expressive versus contained, which describes how comfortable we are communicating our emotions and what we think. Expressive people tend to be energetic and sociable. You don't really have to guess what they are thinking or feeling because, well, they express it. People with a contained preference, on the other hand, are typically harder to get to know and more private with their emotions and thoughts. Next is gregarious versus intimate. It sounds a little weird on paper, but it's referring to the breadth and depth of our relationships. Gregarious people are named Greg.
Come on, Greg.
No, it's a joke. I gotta keep it, gotta keep you on your toes. Gregarious people prefer to socialize and interact with groups and have a broader social circle, while those who are intimate prefer more one-on-one interactions or small social sheddings. Talking be hard. Active versus reflective explains the way we prefer to interact with others as well as how we learn. The active person feels energized speaking and interacting with others as well as learning things in person, the chance to listen and talk with others, while the reflective person is going to feel best as an observer, communicating through writing and learning through reading. Enthusiastic versus quiet is kind of like a meter for how excitable we are. Enthusiastic individuals are full of energy and typically ready to display that, like blood, while quiet individuals prefer to blend in with the background and are generally calmer. This guy here loves blending into the background. He's literally part of the background. Introvert confirmed. So as we went through those first 5 subtraits of introvert versus extrovert, did you find yourself identifying with any that belong to the opposite of your overall preference? For example, let's say you're an introvert, but maybe you lean more towards being expressive rather than contained. Or maybe you feel like you're pretty balanced in a subtrait, such as initiating versus receiving. You're right in the middle between them. Well, that is what's cool about subtraits. You don't have to score on the stereotypical pole of your preferences. You could get an out of preference score with a subtrait on the opposite pole. You could also get a mid-zone score if you are in the mid-zone. You are likely to score in preference for most traits, but not necessarily. That's what causes those variations in type. If you have too many out of preference scores, like if all of them are out of preference, well, you might have your type wrong. just slightly, it's a possibility. Identifying those mid-zone or out of preference scores can really help identify why 2 people of the same type appear to be different. Now let's move on to the next letter dichotomy, sensing versus intuition, which is generally all about how we take in information. The first subtrait is concrete versus abstract, which is the one that we typically think about when we're talking about sensing and intuition. This subtrait is about where we typically focus our attention when looking at new information. Concrete individuals like facts and data, while abstract individuals are more comfortable with the symbolic. The next subtrait is realistic versus imaginative, which is how we use the information that we are noticing. Realistic peeps like sensible and matter-of-fact solutions, like what we know works, while imaginative people are more experimental, looking for a new way of doing things. Practical versus conceptual refers to how we use ideas. Practical people are pragmatic and want to apply their ideas in reality, while conceptual people prefer to think about things just for thinking's sake, like a philosopher. Next up, experiential versus theoretical refers to what information we trust. An experiential person needs to see it to believe it, while a theoretical person trusts the theories and the patterns. The theoretical person probably gets excited trying to guess the endings to movies before they have all the pieces, while the experiential person probably gets more excited as the evidence is revealed. The last S versus N subtrait is traditional versus original, which, as it sounds, is about how we approach traditions and traditional ways of thinking. Do you think that things are the way they are for a reason, or do you throw tradition to the wind in favor of something different? Now, at this point, one thing to keep in mind is that the subtraits are scored differently than the overall dichotomy scores. So for sensing versus intuition, for example, you might score mid-zone on all 5 of those subtraits, but you can't score mid-zone with sensing versus intuition. The subtraits are all on a scale, whereas the letter dichotomies are just one or the other. Why is this, you might ask? Because I said so. Anyway, moving on to thinking versus feeling. Our first set of subtraits is logical versus empathetic, the trait that focuses on how we would ideally prefer to make decisions. Now let me emphasize that. How we would ideally prefer. The logical person would prefer to make decisions impersonally and with impartiality, which might hurt people's feelings, while the empathetic person will struggle with this more because they value harmony so much. Following that up, reasonable versus compassionate is the subtrait which refers to how we actually make decisions. The raisonnable people prefer the truth to be spoken and acted on, even when it will make people unhappy. Compassionate people, on the other hand, are more comfortable skirting around the truth if it will make the situation easier to navigate. So with those two subtraits, you could score out of preference on one and in preference on other, which is why you might have some feelers who, in an ideal world, would love to be logical and rational, but in practice are actually just pushovers. Or, more interestingly, you could have a thinker who is in preference and is logical, but then is out of preference and is more compassionate in their actual actions. The subtraits be bustin' stereotypes, yo. Next subtrait is questioning versus accommodating, and that refers to how we tend to handle differences in ideas and opinions. People who are highly accommodating prefer to come to group consensuses quickly, while the questioning people like to stop and logically analyze every step along the way, even if it causes conflict. They might even enjoy a little bit of conflict, you know what I'm saying? Critical versus accepting is how we express our opinions about disagreements. Critical people are skeptical and will criticize differing viewpoints to see if they hold up, while accepting people prefer to be tolerant of differing opinions and try to find win-win situations. Lastly, we have tough versus tender, which is how does the steak come out when you're the one cooking it? No, I'm kidding. Frank, just stop trying. So this is the general energy we have when carrying out decisions. Tough people are firm and will stand their ground in conversations. They usually focus on the end goal. What are we trying to accomplish here, people? While tender people are gentle and focus on the means rather than the end goal. For the last of the dichotomies, we have judging and perceiving. The first subtrait for this is systematic versus casual, which is about how we generally prefer to organize our lives. The systematic person likes structure and doesn't like to be distracted. They especially don't like surprises. Do not plan their surprise birthday party. The casual person throws all that to the wind and says, it is what it is. If something doesn't go the way it's supposed to, a casual person won't care too much. Next is planful versus open-ending, and that's about our approach to planning. The planful person is always planning. They're always planning at least a little bit ahead. They like meetings on the calendar and planning events ahead of time. The open-ended person, on the other hand, is present-focused and adaptable. If a plan changes at the last minute, no big deal, they can roll with it. Next up, early starting versus pressure-prompted refers to how one prefers to deal with the tasks that they need to get done. If the teacher gives you a homework assignment on Monday and it is due on Friday. When are you gonna start working on it? The early starters prefer to get it over with so they can relax. They're taking it home and getting it done Monday afternoon. While the pressure-prompted persons, they start off relaxing and then get surges of energy closer to the deadline. And as someone who is pressure-prompted, those surges of energy are really just last-minute panic. Next, scheduled versus spontaneous is about how comfortable we are with schedules and routines. Or scheduled, if you're from England. The scheduled person typically likes to make lists that they can cross off. Maybe they have a routine and they don't like a ton of variety. The spontaneous person, on the other hand, gets bored quickly when things are too structured, and they might feel suffocated by a strict schedule. Methodical versus emergent are the ways in which we approach large tasks or difficult tasks. The methodical person wants to develop a plan of attack before approaching a task or a challenge, while the emergent person wants to just jump right in and figure things out as they go. Which subtraits did you identify with the most? Do you think this addition to MBTI is useful or interesting? What out of preference scores do you think you have? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, stay cool and attractive.